Flint, Michigan, 1995. It was a time that felt brittle, balanced precariously between hope and decline. For those clinging to the simple comfort of community and faith, the world outside their door often felt like a place they had to fight to keep out. But sometimes the shadows don't just linger outside. They find a way in, shattering the light forever. The light in the Lawson household was Tiffany Lawson. She was 19, a year out of high school, and possessed an innate, restless energy that often bubbled over into laughter. Tiffany was bright, empathetic, and had the kind of easy kindness that made her seem almost too fragile for the world. Her dreams weren't about grand stages. They were about stability. Maybe cosmetology school, a steady job, a future built on small, attainable steps. Her family was her anchor. The Lawsons were deeply religious, their faith not a performance, though, but a genuine shield against the world's chaos. Her mother, Deborah, and father David relied on their belief to center them, to give them the strength to raise their children in a challenging city. Tiffany was their youngest, their last baby bird, preparing to leave the nest. The day she disappeared, Friday, May 19, 1995, had been unremarkable. Tiffany had spent the morning helping her mother run errands, then headed to the library to study for her GED prep course. Around 5 p.m., she called Deborah, saying she'd run into an old acquaintance who had asked for help with something simple, something urgent, but didn't sound dangerous. She promised to be home by dinner time. That was the last time Deborah Lawson ever heard her daughter's voice. The first few hours of her absence were filled with the usual parental dismissals. She stopped to talk to a friend. Her watch is slow, but as the streetlights came on, casting long, lonely shadows across the neighborhood, the rationalizations dissolved into ice-cold dread. Tiffany was meticulous. She would never fail to call. By midnight, the Flint Police Department was notified, and the search began, a search immediately hobbled by the lack of witnesses or struggle. Tiffany's route home was a familiar, well-traveled one. How could a vibrant 19-year-old girl simply evaporate in the early evening? The days bled into weeks. The Lawsons' home, once warm and welcoming, became a shrine to absence. Deborah would sit in Tiffany's untouched bedroom, running her fingers over the spine of her favorite books, clinging to the scent of her perfume. The family's faith became less of a shield and more of a desperate, grinding discipline. They had to believe she was safe, because the alternative was a void too dark to contemplate. They prayed relentlessly, their knees bruised, their voices raw. The investigation was plagued by false starts. Tip lines went dead. Posters faded in the sun. Detective Marcus Thorne, the seasoned investigator assigned to the case, felt the familiar, heavy despair of a case built on nothing but pain. They knew Tiffany was gone, but they had no crime scene, no physical evidence, no direction. 2 long, agonizing months passed in that state of torturous limbo. Then came the morning of July 27, 1995. A crew from the city's Parks Department, clearing brush in a remote, neglected area near the old industrial park, made the discovery. A large, dark plastic bag, heavily weighted and tucked deep beneath a collapsed drainage pipe. The scene that Detective Thorne and his team encountered was instantly, violently sickening. This was not a quick dumping. This was something depraved, something calculated. The bag contained human remains, parts chillingly dismembered. The police immediately launched a wider forensics of the area and within hours confirmed the worst. Through dental records, the fragments belonged to Tiffany Lawson. The initial crime scene analysis revealed a terrifying level of control. The manner of the dismemberment, the cold, precise separation of limbs and torso, the clean cuts to the bones, suggested a chilling, almost technical approach. The brutality was a profound shock to the system of the city. Tiffany Lawson hadn't just been murdered, she had been violated in the final, most grotesque way possible. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was exsanguination. She had been killed by deep, calculated cuts to her major veins, causing her to bleed out quickly. The most disturbing finding came when the police located more bags in a deeper culvert. Some of Tiffany's internal organs, her viscera, had been deliberately removed, packaged, and preserved. Frozen. Detective Thorne felt a cold dread settle in his bones. This wasn't passion. This wasn't street violence. This was preparation. This was a motive so alien, so utterly cold, that it defied simple categorization. The killer was not just hiding a body. They were trying to preserve parts of it. The physical evidence was meager, cheap, unbranded black trash bags, and crucially, trace amounts of tissue clinging to the remains and the link being too amped. The discovery of Tiffany Lawson's fragmented remains did not bring closure. It opened a deeper, darker wound in the community of Flint. The sheer brutality, the calculated dismemberment, the grotesque preservation of internal organs shattered any illusion of safety. Detective Thorne and his team were under immense pressure, yet every new piece of information seemed to pull them further from a solid suspect. The first critical piece of evidence was the one they least expected. The killer's DNA profile pointed to a female perpetrator. This discovery immediately eliminated hundreds of hours of work dedicated to tracking known male predators and created an almost unimaginable mental hurdle. The precision, the cold, physical act of butchery. It didn't align with the common profiles of female killers, who typically used poison or were motivated by close domestic relationships. This suggested a rare, predatory, and psychologically disturbed individual. They had a suspect profile, female, local to Flint, and demonstrating a chilling level of control and emotional detachment. The investigative focus turned to the single, defining motive, the freezing of the organs. Detective Thorne, along with newly assigned Detective Sarah Chen, a young, sharp-eyed officer whose faith in forensics was absolute, began consulting experts. Organ trafficking rings were quickly dismissed. The method was amateurish and too chaotic. They settled on a more terrifying conclusion. The killer was operating under a delusion of commerce. She believed in her own fractured reality that she could profit, that she could sell human parts, and that freezing them was a necessary step for marketability. This suggested a motive rooted in desperation and severe mental instability, overlaid by an acute, crushing financial panic. The immediate, relentless canvass of the industrial park and the surrounding abandoned houses began. They were looking for an improvised slaughterhouse, a place where the murder and the dismemberment could have been carried out with such privacy. Days after the remains were found, police located an abandoned, dilapidated house 2 blocks from where Tiffany had made her last phone call. The property was long derelict, surrounded by overgrown weeds, and its windows were boarded up. Perfect place for an unseen crime. Inside, under UV light, forensics found the faint residual signature of an immense cleanup attempt, microscopic blood spatter in the bathroom, consistent with the victim's DNA, and minute, dried biological residue in the bathtub and kitchen sink. This was the makeshift crime scene. Crucially, the house yielded 2 key pieces of physical evidence that helped define the killer. A specific brand of cheap, bulk-purchased kitchen knife, the type sold at discount liquidation stores, found hidden beneath a floorboard. Drug paraphernalia, specifically an old, scorched spoon and discarded needles, confirming the killer's addiction and lending credence to the theory of deep poverty and desperation. The initial DNA profile, a partial female profile, was run through the state and federal CODIS database. The results were devastating. No match. The killer was not a known felon in the system. The trace evidence, their single best clue, had led them to a ghost. The case, despite the horrifying physical evidence, went cold. The Lawsons' grief, which had been momentarily given direction by the discovery, now settled into a permanent, agonizing state of suspension. They were left with the knowledge of their daughter's terrible fate, but without the justice necessary to bury the pain. Deborah Lawson took on a solemn, heartbreaking ritual. Every single Sunday morning for the rest of her life, she placed a fresh arrangement of Tiffany's favorite white lilies in a small, crystal vase on the kitchen table, right where Tiffany had sat for breakfast. This simple act was not about mourning. It was about defiance. It was the family's unwavering shield against the madness of the unsolved crime, a visual declaration that Tiffany's light would not be extinguished by the dark. Detective Thorne officially retired in the early 2000s, leaving the Tiffany Lawson file, now a thick, dust-covered binder, with a personal note to his successor, Chen. This one is pure desperation. Look for the money, not the rage. The woman they were looking for, the phantom female perpetrator, was Lorraine Vance. She was 40 years old in 1995, and her life was a continuous downward spiral of poverty, addiction, and untreated mental illness. She was precisely the kind of person who fades into the noise of an inner city, invisible to all but the legal and social systems that had long since given up on her. Lori Vance was born into abuse. Her home life was a terror orchestrated by a vicious mother and the mother's boyfriend, who began sexually abusing Lori when she was a child. Her education was non-existent. She was functionally illiterate. Her early existence was a constant fight for survival. This sustained, traumatic abuse carved deep, permanent canyons in her psyche, leaving her perpetually teetering on the edge of reality. The final, shattering trauma occurred when Lori was just 15. She had endured years of this brutality, but on a cold night, driven past all breaking points, she struck back. She confessed years later, in a broken whisper, that she had murdered her abusive mother, staging it to look like an overdose or a domestic incident, something the overwhelmed local authorities at the time failed to properly investigate. Lori then ran, terrified and free, escaping into the shadows of the streets, her mother's blood a permanent stain on her soul. This act, buried deep within her, was the foundation of her adult psychosis, the ultimate proof that to survive, you must be capable of the ultimate cruelty. By 1995, Lori was a shell of a person, squatting in the abandoned house near the industrial park, surviving through petty crime and the transient help of others. She was addicted, terrified of her mounting, overwhelming debt to drug dealers, and facing an existential terror worse than death, being forced back into a shelter or the system. This pressure, the debt, the addiction, the lifelong psychological scarring, pushed her over the edge. In a moment of psychotic, desperate clarity, she developed the bizarre, terrible plan. She had no education, no contacts, but she had seen enough low-budget thrillers and read enough lurid headlines to create the delusional notion that there was a secret, high-paying market for human remains. It was her final, impossible gamble to escape financial ruin. Tiffany Lawson, the sweet girl offering a helping hand to a seemingly frail woman, was simply the object of opportunity, the key to Lori Vance's warped salvation. Lori had staked out the area, watching the simple routines of the locals. When she saw Tiffany, kind, young, and trusting, she lured her back to the abandoned house with a fake plea for help. Once inside, Lori, operating from a place of cold, desperate functionality, used the knife she'd purchased to end Tiffany's life quickly, aiming for the major blood vessels, minimizing the struggle and the noise. She then performed the act of dismemberment, packaging the remains, and chillingly preserving the organs for her imagined lucrative transaction. When she went out to find a buyer, a dealer, a fence, anyone who might validate her terrible plan, she was met only with ridicule, suspicion, or fear. The black market for her gruesome product simply did not exist. Terrified that she would be caught with the evidence of her depravity, she dumped the remaining bags haphazardly in the surrounding scrubland, hoping the earth would hide her secret, and then attempted to bleach and scrub the apartment clean. Lori Vance returned to her life of invisible existence, a 40-year-old, drug-addicted, homeless, and psychotic woman who had committed the perfect, monstrous crime. The DNA she left behind was her only mistake, and it was a mistake that would wait 15 years for the technology to catch up and give it a voice. The case remained an open wound. The female DNA profile remained unmatched. Detective Chen in the small cold case unit periodically reviewed the file, but without a new technological advancement, the case of Tiffany Lawson was destined to be swallowed by time, another dark chapter in Flint's history, guarded by the silent presence of a desperate, invisible woman. The first decade after Tiffany Lawson's murder was defined by silence. For the Flint Police Department, the case of the Frozen Homicide settled into a familiar, frustrating venom. Annual reviews, mandatory check-ins with the family, and the heavy acknowledgement that without a major technological leap, the file would remain sealed. The partial female DNA profile, stored in a freezer, was the ghost of the investigation, a unique biological signature that had no name, no address, and no voice in the vast CODIS database. For Detective Sarah Chen, who inherited the file in the early 2000s, the case became an anchor, a quiet, insistent professional burden. She would pull the file out every year, running the old evidence through updated, more sensitive extraction techniques. She felt a deep, personal connection to the Lawsons, observing Deborah's solemn, unyielding ritual, the placement of white lilies every Sunday morning, a silent testimony to a grief that refused to subside. The Lawsons' faith was their shield, but Chen's faith lay in science, and she was waiting for science to catch up to the sheer depravity of the crime. Around 2010, the first small flicker of hope emerged. Advancements in mitochondrial DNA sequencing allowed the forensic lab to re-examine the minuscule traces of epithelial cells lifted from the plastic sheeting in 1995. The DNA was highly degraded, a fact of its age and the initial cleaning, but the new techniques could work with a heartier mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited maternally. The lab successfully generated a cleaner, more robust profile of the unknown female killer. It didn't provide an identity, but it confirmed with absolute certainty that the person who handled Tiffany's remains was a woman. This cleaned-up profile was the only thing standing between the Lawsons and utter despair. But the real revolution didn't come from internal police databases. It came from the private sector, from the world of hobbyists and family historians. By 2017, forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG, had begun to solve cold cases across the country, transforming trace evidence into detailed family trees. Detective Chen knew this was their last best chance. The decision to pursue FGG was complex. It was expensive, required high-level expertise, and the use of private genetic data presented ethical and procedural hurdles. But Chen, driven by the quiet strength of the Lawson family and the horrifying nature of the crime, pushed it through. The precious DNA sample, the epithelial ghost, was sent to a specialized lab for processing and uploading to a publicly available genealogy database. The success of FGG depends entirely on finding a distant relative of the perpetrator who has submitted their own DNA for genealogical research. The first step was agonizingly slow. The algorithm didn't immediately pinpoint a close relative. Instead, it returned a complex, sprawling web of third, fourth, and fifth cousins. The profile belonged to a woman with deep, established roots of the American Midwest, but the trail was too wide, too vast. They needed a guide. That guide was Dr. Vivian Hsu, a private forensic genealogist with a background in complex family mapping. Dr. Hsu was brought onto the case, and she approached the Tiffany Lawson file with a detached, clinical reverence. Her job was to turn biology into biography, to construct a perpetrator's family tree based on minute genetic overlaps. "We're looking for a 1 in a million needle in a haystack of 500,000 names," Dr. Hsu explained to Chen during their initial meeting. "The genetic marker is clear, but the last shared ancestor could have lived in 1850. We have to build that tree backwards, generation by generation, and then follow every living descendant forward to see who was in Flint, Michigan in 1995. The work was painstaking, a brutal process of historical detective work. Dr. Hsu and her team spent months cross-referencing public records, birth certificates, obituary newspaper archives, marriage licenses, and historical census data. They started with the most distant but highest quality match, a third cousin twice removed, a retired schoolteacher living in a remote town in Alaska. This Alaskan connection was key, confirming a familial line that hadn't moved from the Midwest until the mid-20th century. By locking down that single distant branch, Dr. Hsu established the two great-great-grandparents who were the shared source of the DNA. Now the slow, agonizing process of convergence began. Dr. Hoshi meticulously mapped the family down through the generations, identifying every child, every grandchild, and every potential descendant who was born between 1945 and 1965, the likely birth window for a 40-year-old perpetrator in 1995. This process yielded over 300 individuals, but by layering in location data, cross-referencing the family trees against Flint, Michigan public records from the 1990s, the list began to shrink dramatically. Dr. Ashu's focus eventually settled on a cluster of 3 first cousins who lived within a 5-mile radius of the abandoned house where Tiffany's remains had been butchered. 2 were men, immediately dismissed by the DNA profile. The third was a woman whose presence in Flint had been continuous and invisible, Lorraine Vance. The thiol on Lori Vance was thin, a ghost of paper trail consisting of old public assistance applications, occasional misdemeanor drug possession arrests that never resulted in a CODIS entry, and numerous addresses that tracked her decline into homelessness and addiction. When Detective Chen looked at the photo, the visual shock was immense. The killer they had mentally profiled for decades, the strong, cold manipulator who executed a surgical crime, was a small, frail-looking woman with hollow eyes and the unmistakable weariness of a hard, brutal life. She was 40 years old in 1995, perfectly fitting the age window, and she lived precisely in the epicenter of the crime. The psychological profile snapped into terrifying focus. The lack of physical strength for the dismemberment was explained by the use of specialized, sharp instruments, the butcher knife found under the floorboard, and the application of chilling, methodical patience. The motive wasn't rage. It was the sheer, paralyzing desperation of a woman with overwhelming debt and no mental stability, clinging to a delusional escape hatch. Detective Chen's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The epithelial ghost had finally given up a name. But a name was not enough. They needed a direct, modern, uncompromised DNA sample from Lori Vance to confirm the FGG results and stand up in court. A delicate, high-stakes surveillance operation was immediately authorized. Lori Vance, now 56, was living in a rundown, transient boarding house on the eastern edge of Flint, still existing on the margins, seemingly unchanged by the 2 decades that had passed. The cold case team watched her every movement, documenting her patterns of addiction and her transient habits. The plan was simple, clinical, and fraught with risk. Obtain an abandoned DNA sample, something she discarded naturally, free from police coercion. One overcast afternoon, Lori was observed sitting alone on a cracked concrete bench outside a laundromat, smoking a cheap cigarette. Detective Chen, disguised in plain clothes, waited across the street in an unmarked car, the tension in the vehicle almost audible. The moment was suspended, years of pain and procedure narrowed down to a single toxic cigarette butt. When Lori finished, she carelessly flicked the cigarette butt into a planter box and shuffled away. Chen gave the area 5 minutes to clear. Then a forensic technician, moving quickly and efficiently, retrieved the cigarette butt using sterile equipment, packaging it meticulously. It was sealed, tagged, and immediately rushed to the state laboratory. The atmosphere back at the Flint Police Department was electric. The Lawsons, unaware of the breakthrough, continued their quiet vigil. Detective Chen, unable to sleep, waited. Every minute stretched into an hour, every hour into a day of agonizing uncertainty. She kept the photo of Lori Vance next to the file, trying to reconcile the image of the exhausted, frail woman with the grotesque horror of the crime scene. Finally, the call came in. The voice on the other end of the line was the lead analyst, controlled but vibrating with finality. The DNA profile from the cigarette butt belonging to Lori Vance was an absolute, non-negotiable match to the epithelial cells recovered from Tiffany Lawson's remains in 1995. The silence that followed this confirmation was deeper than any they had known in the 2 decades of the cold case. It was the sound of a terrifying truth finally locking into place. The ghost had spoken. The monster was named. Lori Vance, the 40-year-old, drug-addicted, desperate woman, had been living in the shadows of Flint for 22 years, quietly carrying the weight of the Frozen Homicide. Her lifelong descent into poverty, abuse, and mental illness had culminated in a calculated act of monstrous cruelty, fueled not by hate for Tiffany, but by a warped, pathological vision of financial survival. The investigation, frozen in time for 22 years, was now moving at the speed of justice. The time for surveillance was over. The time for confrontation had arrived. The first decade after Tiffany Lawson's murder was defined by silence. For the Flint Police Department, the case of the Frozen Homicide settled into a familiar, frustrating rhythm. Annual reviews, mandatory check-ins with the family, and the heavy acknowledgement that without a major technological leap, the file would remain sealed. The partial female DNA profile, stored in a freezer, was the ghost of the investigation, a unique biological signature that had no name, no address, and no voice in the vast CODIS database. For Detective Sarah Chen, who inherited the file in the early 2000s, the case became an anchor, a quiet, insistent professional burden. She would pull the file out every year, running the old evidence through updated, more sensitive extraction techniques. She felt a deep, personal connection to the Lawsons, observing Deborah's solemn, unyielding ritual, the placement of white lilies every Sunday morning, a silent testimony to a grief that refused to subside. The Lawsons' faith was their shield, but Chen's faith lay in science, and she was waiting for science to catch up to the sheer depravity of the crime. Around 2010, the first small flicker of hope emerged. Advancements in mitochondrial DNA sequencing allowed the forensic lab to re-examine the minuscule traces of epithelial cells lifted from the plastic sheeting in 1995. The DNA was highly degraded, a fact of its age and the initial cleaning, but the new techniques could work with the hardier mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited maternally. The lab successfully generated a cleaner, more robust profile of the unknown female killer. It didn't provide an identity, but it confirmed, with absolute certainty, that the person who handled Tiffany's remains was a woman. This cleaned-up profile was the only thing standing between the Lawsons and utter despair. But the real revolution didn't come from internal police databases. It came from the private sector, from the world of hobbyists and family historians. By 2017, forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG, had begun to solve cold cases across the country to transforming trace evidence into detailed family trees. Detective Chen knew this was their last best chance. The decision to pursue FGG was complex. It was expensive, required high-level expertise, and the use of private genetic data presented ethical and procedural hurdles. But Chen, driven by the quiet strength of the Lawson family and the horrifying nature of the crime, pushed it through. The precious DNA sample, the epithelial ghost, was sent to a specialized lab for processing and uploading to a publicly available genealogy database. The success of FGG depends entirely on finding a distant relative of the perpetrator who has submitted their own DNA for genealogical research. The first step was agonizingly slow. The algorithm didn't immediately pinpoint a close relative. Instead, it returned a complex, sprawling web of third, fourth, and fifth cousins. The profile belonged to a woman with deep, established roots in the American Midwest, but the trail was too wide, too vast. They needed a guide. That guide was Dr. Vivian Hsu, a private forensic genealogist with a background in complex family mapping. Dr. Hsu was brought onto the case, and she approached the Tiffany Lawson file with a detached, clinical reverence. Her job was to turn biology into biography, to construct a perpetrator's family tree based on minute genetic overlaps. "We're looking for a 1 in a million needle in a haystack of 500,000 names," Dr. Hsu explained to Chen during their initial meeting. "The genetic marker is clear, but the last shared ancestor could have lived in 1850. We have to build that tree backwards, generation by generation, and then follow every living descendant forward to see who was in Flint, Michigan in 1995. The work was painstaking, a brutal process of historical detective work. Dr. Hsu and her team spent months cross-referencing public records, birth certificates, obiter newspaper archives, marriage licenses, and historical census data. They started with the most distant but highest quality match, a third cousin, twice removed, a retired schoolteacher living in a remote town in Alaska. This Alaskan connection was key, confirming a familiar line that hadn't moved from the Midwest until the mid-20th century. By locking down that single distant branch, Dr. Hsu established the two great-great-grandparents who were the shared source of the DNA. Now the slow, agonizing process of convergence began. Dr. Hsu meticulously mapped the family down through the generations, identifying every child, every grandchild, and every potential descendant who was born between 1945 and 1965, the likely birth window for a 40-year-old perpetrator in 1995. This process yielded over 300 individuals, but by layering in location data, cross-referencing the family trees against Flint, Michigan public records from the 1990s, the list began to shrink dramatically. Dr. Hsu's focus eventually settled on a cluster of 3 first cousins who lived within a 5-mile radius of the abandoned house where Tiffany's remains had been butchered. 2 were men, immediately dismissed by the DNA profile. The third was a woman whose presence in Flint had been continuous and invisible, Lorraine Vance. The file on Lori Vance was thin, a ghost of paper trail consisting of old public assistance applications, occasional misdemeanor drug possession arrests that never resulted in a CODIS entry, and numerous addresses that tracked her decline into homelessness and addiction. When Detective Chen looked at the photo, the visual shock was immense. The killer they had mentally profiled for decades, the strong, cold manipulator who executed a surgical crime, was a small, frail-looking woman with hollow eyes and the unmistakable weariness of a hard, brutal life. She was 40 years old in 1995, perfectly fitting the age window, and she lived precisely in the epicenter of the crime. The psychological profile snapped into terrifying focus. The lack of physical strength for the dismemberment was explained by the use of specialized sharp instruments, the butcher knife found under the floorboard, and the application of chilling, methodical patience. The motive wasn't rage. It was the sheer, paralyzing desperation of a woman with overwhelming debt and no mental stability, clinging to a delusional escape hatch. Detective Chen's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The epithelial ghost had finally given up a name, but a name was not enough. They needed a direct, modern, uncompromised DNA sample from Lori Vance to confirm the FGG results and stand up in court. A delicate, high-stakes surveillance operation was immediately authorized. Lori Vance, now 56, was living in a run-down, transient boarding house on the eastern edge of Flint, still existing on the margins, seemingly unchanged by the 2 decades that had passed. The cold case team watched her every movement, documenting her patterns of addiction and her transient habits. The plan was simple, clinical, and fraught with risk. Obtain an abandoned DNA sample, something she discarded naturally, free from police coercion. One overcast afternoon, Lori was observed sitting alone on a cracked concrete bench outside a laundromat, smoking a cheap cigarette. Detective Chen, disguised in plain clothes, waited across the street in an unmarked car, the tension in the vehicle almost audible. The moment was suspended, years of pain and procedure, narrowed down to a single toxic cigarette butt. When Lori finished, she carelessly flicked the cigarette butt into a planter box and shuffled away. Chen gave the area 5 minutes to clear. Then a forensic technician, moving quickly and efficiently, retrieved the cigarette butt using sterile equipment, packaging it meticulously. It was sealed, tagged, and immediately rushed to the state laboratory. The atmosphere back at the Flint Police Department was electric. The Lawsons, unaware of the breakthrough, continued their quiet vigil. Detective Chen, unable to sleep, waited. Every minute stretched into an hour, every hour into a day of agonizing uncertainty. She kept the photo of Lori Vance next to the file, trying to reconcile the image of the exhausted, frail woman with the grotesque horror of the crime scene. Finally, the call came in. The voice on the other end of the line was the lead analyst, controlled but vibrating with finality. The DNA profile from the cigarette butt belonging to Lori Vance was an absolute, non-negotiable match to the epithelial cells recovered from Tiffany Lawson's remains in 1995. The silence that followed this confirmation was deeper than any they had known in the 2 decades of the cold case. It was the sound of a terrifying truth finally locking into place. The ghost had spoken. The monster was named. Lori Vance, the 40-year-old, drug-addicted, desperate woman, had been living in the shadows of Flint for 22 years, quietly carrying the weight of the Frozen Homicide. Her lifelong descent into poverty, abuse, and mental illness had culminated in a calculated act of monstrous cruelty, fueled not by hate for Tiffany, but by a warped, pathological vision of financial survival. The investigation, frozen in time for 22 years, was now moving at the speed of justice. The time for surveillance was over. The time for confrontation had arrived. The arrest of Lori Vance was executed with quiet, professional precision. 2 decades of agonizing investigation, fueled by faith, frustration, and the relentless march of science, had led to this moment. When Detective Sarah Chen and her team approached the transient boarding house in the cold, pre-dawn hours, they weren't confronting a hardened criminal mastermind. They were confronting a broken ghost of a woman. Lori Vance, now 56, looked frail, exhausted, and seemed almost relieved that the performance of a normal life was finally over. She was brought to the Flint Police Department's interrogation room, a sterile, silent box designed to amplify psychological pressure. Detective Chet, flanked by a veteran officer, sat across from her. Chen knew that traditional interrogation tactics wouldn't work on a woman with severe mental instability, drug dependency, and a lifetime of deep-seated trauma. This needed to be an exercise in patience and pressure, aimed at cracking the deeply layered shell of her psychosis. For the first few hours, Lori Vance was a study in non-cooperation. She fidgeted, mumbled about her past and her debt, denied any knowledge of Tiffany Lawson, and stared vaguely at the one-way mirror. Her responses were tangential, fragmented, and often nonsensical, drifting between reality and delusion. Detective Chen, however, didn't press the DNA evidence immediately. She focused on the motive, the overwhelming debt, the desperation, the terror of destitution. She spoke not like a prosecutor, but like someone who understood the bottomless terror of being completely alone, pushing the narrative of Laurie's own lifelong suffering. "Laurie," Chen said softly, leaning forward, her voice low and empathetic, "we know you didn't hate Tiffany. Tiffany was kind. She was there. You were desperate. You needed to fix the debt. You needed money. And you did something you thought was the only way out, didn't you?" The word desperate seemed to snag in Laurie's fragile mind. Her eyes, which had been darting around the room, finally focused on Chen. A tremor ran through her body. "They were going to take everything," Laurie whispered, her voice raspy, thick with years of neglect. "The man with the bills, he said I was worthless, just trash. But I thought, if I had something valuable—" Chen pressed the point, her voice becoming slightly firmer, threading conviction through the empathy. "You thought you could make it valuable. You had this idea, this plan. You prepared. You froze the organs, didn't you? You thought you could sell them. Tell me about the house, Laurie. Tell me about the knife." The shift from the abstract pain of debt to the concrete horror of the crime was too much. The fragile wall Laurie had built over 22 years buckled. Her eyes widened, tears mixed with fear streaming down her face. She began to rock violently, her hands gripping the edge of the metal table. "I didn't want the smell. I didn't want to lose the chance," she shrieked, her voice suddenly erupting from a place of profound internal horror. She then began to scream, long, high-pitched, unintelligible cries of terror and despair, rocking and hyperventilating, her psychological facade completely disintegrating. When the screaming subsided, replaced by shuddering silence, Laurie started talking again, but this time the words were a torrent, a disorganized, rambling, but terrifyingly honest confession of the murder. She described luring Tiffany with the fake plea for help, the brief, quiet struggle, and the final cold act of cutting the major veins. She confirmed the location was the abandoned house. She confirmed the motive was the delusional plan to use the remains as a financial commodity, and her frantic, drug-fueled attempts to find a buyer before fear drove her to dump the bags. "She was so quiet," Laurie muttered, her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked like a doll when she stopped moving. But then I had to package it. It was going to be my fortune, my way out of the trash heap." Then, amidst the horrifying details of Tiffany's murder, true, deeply buried plot twist emerged, spilling out like infected matter from a lifelong wound. The years of pressure, the shame, and the fear of the crime she was confessing pulled out the decades-old secret, the very trauma that had forged her into a killer. "It wasn't the first time I made things quiet," Laurie whispered, her voice thin, distant, almost childlike. "The lady with the sharp voice, she deserved to be quiet. She let him touch me. She let him hurt me." Detective Chen, startled, prompted her gently. "The lady, Laurie? Who are you talking about?" Laurie raised her eyes, wet and utterly vacant. "My mother, when I was 15. She was so mean. She was going to send me away. I made her quiet. I took the wire. And then I ran. Nobody cared. Nobody ever knew." The revelation, a confession to a second, decades-old homicide, hit Detective Chen with the force of a physical blow. The seemingly random, opportunistic killer of Tiffany Lawson was, in fact, a deeply traumatized serial survivor, a child who killed her abuser and spent the next 25 years hiding in plain sight, using drugs and psychosis to suppress the profound guilt and the terrifying knowledge of her own capacity for violence. The murder of her mother at 15 wasn't just a crime. It was the traumatic foundation upon which her subsequent delusions were built. The rest of the confession was meticulously documented, detailing her entire, miserable life on the streets of Flint, her attempts to suppress the mother's murder, and the ultimate spiral that led her to prey on Tiffany's kindness. The interrogation concluded, leaving Detective Chen emotionally drained. The monster was real, but she was also a product of unbearable abuse, a broken human being who had turned her internal psychological damage outwards. The single, chilling line that echoed in Chen's mind, summarizing Laurie's warped logic, came right at the end of the session. delivered with a desperate plea. "I just needed something valuable, Detective. Anything. I was so worthless." The raw sincerity of her statement achieved its goal. It humanized Tiffany and focused the jury's attention on the immeasurable cost of the crime. The defense, led by a capable public defender, launched their counterattack with a focus on diminished capacity. They brought in psychiatrists who testified to Lori Vance's severe post-traumatic stress disorder, her lifelong untreated paranoia, her drug addiction, and the profound psychotic break that made her genuinely believe the absurd idea of selling human remains. They argued that the trauma of her childhood, culminating in the murder of her abusive mother at age 15, had rendered her incapable of forming the rational, premeditated intent necessary for capital murder. Lori Vance herself did not take the stand. Her mental state was too volatile, and her defense attorney correctly feared she would either recant or descend into psychotic rambling, undercutting the carefully constructed defense of helplessness. In her closing argument, ADA Reed returned to the core evidence, systematically dismantling the defense's argument. She used a powerful metaphor to bring the chaotic crime back into focus. "You have heard about the broken mind of Lori Vance. That is true. She is a deeply damaged human being, but a damaged machine can still perform its function. Lori Vance planned, she packaged, she prepared. She was not a victim in that moment. She was the architect of horror. Don't allow the pain of her past to excuse the savagery of her choice. Lori Vance is not just a woman who snapped. She is, as the evidence proves, the greed hidden behind a gentle mask." The case went to the jury. The deliberations were agonizingly slow, stretching over 3 full days. The jury struggled not with the identity of the killer. The DNA was absolute, but with the question of intent and sanity. Could a person so clearly delusional still be held accountable for premeditation? The battle was waged between the cold science of the prosecution and the chaos of the defense's psychological narrative. Finally, on the evening of the 3rd day, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed, the silence palpable. Lori Vance remained impassive, as if the verdict were being delivered to someone else. The foreman stood. When asked for the finding on the charge of capital murder, a single word landed with the force of 22 years of pent-up grief and tension: guilty. A wave of emotion, held tightly for decades, finally broke over the Lawson family. Deborah buried her face in David's shoulder, a profound, rattling sob escaping her. David, tears streaming down his face, simply nodded, his eyes closed in a moment of pure, exhausted surrender. Justice, though delayed and imperfect, had arrived. Lori Vance was immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was a victory for the Lawsons, for Detective Chen, and for the revolutionary science that delivered it. It was a formal acknowledgement that Tiffany Lawson's life mattered, and that the person responsible for her horrific end would be held fully accountable. Lori Vance was taken into custody, her long, tormented existence now confined to a prison cell, the secrets of her past, including the murder of her mother, now fully exposed, though only the Tiffany Lawson conviction would define her remaining days. The agonizing wait for the verdict stretched into a 3rd, torturous day. The jury, sequestered in a nearby hotel, was grappling with the fundamental question of the trial: intent versus insanity. Could the profound trauma and psychosis of Lori Vance truly absolve her of the chilling calculation evident in the crime? The knife purchase, the lure, the freezing of the viscera? The tension in the courthouse had become a physical presence, an oppressive weight that crushed hope and exhaustion into a fine, sharp dust. In the jury room, the arguments were fierce. The forensic evidence, the DNA from the discarded cigarette matching the epithelial cells on the plastic sheeting, was undeniable. But the defense's testimony about Lori's lifelong abuse and her delusional financial motives had hit home with several jurors. She was planning to sell the parts, one juror argued, referencing the prosecution's key point. That's motive. That's premeditation. But her plan was insane, countered another. No rational person believes they can sell human guts on the street for a fortune. That's a mind broken by drugs and abuse. She acted under diminished capacity, not criminal intent. The deadlock was broken only when the foreman, a retired accountant, brought the discussion back to the crime itself. Look at the medical examiner's report again. The principal veins. The cut was precise. It wasn't a frenzy. It was a cold, efficient act aimed at killing quickly and cleanly, allowing for the next step, the dismemberment. The freezing is proof of planning, however insane the goal was. The intent to kill for profit was there. Finally, a consensus was reached, aligning the legal definition of capital intent with the brutal efficiency of the evidence. When the jury returned, the courtroom was packed. Every eye was fixed on the 12 faces that held 22 years of history in their verdict. Lori Vance was led in, appearing even smaller and more disconnected than usual. She wore a blank, almost infantile expression, her eyes drifting above the crowd, refusing to engage with the reality of her judgment. Deborah and David Lawson stood as the verdict was read. Their hands were clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. David leaned heavily on the pew, his gaze fixed on the foreman. The court clerk's voice was dry and formal as he asked, "On the charge of capital murder of Tiffany Lawson, how do you find?" The foreman, a tall, gray-haired man, cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The single word fell like an axe. It was not a loud sound, but it struck the room with devastating force. Deborah Lawson did not scream or collapse. Instead, a profound, shuddering sob was torn from her chest, a sound that was not grief, but pure, agonizing release. She fell into David's embrace, her rigid posture finally dissolving. David, tears streaming down his face, simply nodded, his eyes closed, muttering, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord." It was a moment of utter, exhausted surrender. The silent 22-year vigil was over. Judge Thompson ordered the immediate sentencing, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Before Lori Vance was removed, Judge Thompson granted the Lawsons their final, crucial moment, the victim impact statement. Deborah Lawson approached the lectern, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes burning with resolute clarity. She looked directly at the back of Lori Vance's head, who remained stubbornly unmoving. "Lori Vance," Deborah began, her voice trembling, yet piercingly clear. "You said you needed something valuable. You said you were worthless. I hope you understand that the life you stole, the life of my beautiful daughter Tiffany, was the most valuable thing in this world, and you threw it away for a delusion." She paused, collecting herself, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "You were broken by what happened to you as a child, and that is a tragedy. But you made a choice to take our light, and your history of pain does not erase the fact of her goodness. You took her ability to forgive, her ability to love, her ability to become something more." Deborah walked closer, resting her hand on the railing. "For 22 years, we had to live with the knowledge of what you did in that dark house. We prayed that our faith would not break. And today, your guilt is proven. You will spend the rest of your life knowing that your path to escape, your path to value, ended with your final, absolute confinement. You took her future, but you did not take her dignity." Her words hung in the air, a spiritual pronouncement that seemed to reach the very core of Lori Vance's shattered psyche. As the bailiffs moved to escort the defendant away, Lori finally, involuntarily, turned her head. Her eyes, filled with confusion and fear, met Deborah Lawson's for a fleeting, terrifying moment. It was the only acknowledgement of their shared reality. Lori Vance was quickly ushered out, the faint click of the closing door marking her final exit from the free world. For Detective Sarah Chen, who watched the scene unfold, the end was bittersweet. The case was closed, the promise to the Lawsons fulfilled. She knew that Lori Vance was a product of systemic failure, a victim who was failed by every protective institution from childhood onward, but the needs of justice and the memory of Tiffany Lawson demanded accountability. The conviction was a triumph of science over secrecy, but the ultimate tragedy, the profound loss on both sides of the courtroom, was inescapable. Lori Vance was formally charged with the capital murder of Tiffany Lawson. The news stunned the city. The monster was not a shadowy organization or a mysterious man. It was a destitute, aging woman whose pathology was forged by Flint's own history of poverty and neglect. For Deborah and David Lawson, the arrest was both a moment of profound, dizzying relief and a deeper horror. Learning the identity of the killer, a woman who lived on the margins, driven by a delusion, was almost as unbelievable as the crime itself. They had their name. Their faith had been tested and bent, but had not been broken. They turned their attention from the long vigil of prayer to the painful, final stage, the trial. They knew this was only the start of the final battle to restore dignity to their daughter's memory. Detective Chen, meanwhile, initiated an immediate confidential review of the mother's death from 25 years prior. Knowing that the ghost Lori Vance had been running from for her entire adult life was now finally caught, dragging the past into the present. The arrest of Lori Vance in 2017 provided the Flint community with a name, but the long, agonizing journey to justice was far from over. The confession to Detective Chen, while powerful, was only the first step. The trial itself would be the crucible, where the scientific certainty of DNA met the chaos and complexity of the human mind. The case was assigned to Assistant District Attorney Monica Reed, a prosecutor known for her quiet intensity and an almost surgical precision in presenting forensic evidence. Reed's strategy was singular: to neutralize the defendant's mental instability and addiction defense by focusing exclusively on the cold, calculated intent evidenced by the preparation of the crime. This was not an act of spontaneous rage, Reed argued to her team. It was a business transaction, however warped. She purchased the knife. She chose the abandoned house. She meticulously preserved the organs. These are not the actions of a person who simply snapped. These are the actions of a predator driven by a single-minded monetary goal. The prosecution's timeline was devastating. They would use Dr. Vivian Chu's genealogical map to show the precise tracing, the undeniable DNA match from the discarded cigarette, and the horrific physical evidence recovered by the medical examiner. The emotional climax would be the testimony of the Lawsons, punctuated by the gruesome findings, the deliberate cut to the principal veins, the freezer bags. The defense, however, immediately seized upon Lori Vance's profound history of trauma and mental illness. They argued for an insanity defense, or at minimum, a reduced charge of manslaughter due to diminished capacity. Lori's lawyers painted a picture of a woman who was a lifelong victim, driven mad by overwhelming debt, drug abuse, and the deep-seated psychosis rooted in the murder of her own abusive mother at age 15, a secret now publicly confirmed by the police investigation spurred by Lori's confession. The defense sought to position Lori not as a monster, but as a pitiable, broken survivor whose mind had finally snapped under the weight of her trauma and addiction. She was not capable of forming criminal intent, her defense attorney would argue. Her plan to sell human remains was not shrewd business. It was the frantic, delusional act of a mind utterly broken by 50 years of neglect and abuse. For the Lawson family, the pretrial phase was excruciating. They were forced to confront not just the facts of Tiffany's murder, but the terrifying, squalid details of the killer's life. Deborah and David Lawson's faith, their primary source of strength, was now tested against the darkest examples of human depravity and psychological damage. They had to reconcile the gentle spirit of their daughter with the abject horror of her end, and the knowledge that the killer was a broken, abused woman. David Lawson took on the burden of attending every pretrial hearing, quiet, resolute presence in the courtroom gallery. His daily ritual shifted from a personal vigil to a public, unblinking demand for accountability. His presence was a silent declaration. They would not allow Lori Vance's trauma to eclipse Tiffany's humanity. They would not allow the defense to turn the courtroom into a stage for the killer's past suffering. The police, meanwhile, faced a logistical nightmare in preparing the case file for the murder of Lori Vance's mother, a 22-year-old cold case that had been shelved as an accidental death. While Lori's confession was detailed, the ability to prosecute a second decades-old homicide while simultaneously trying the high-profile murder of Tiffany Lawson was a complication the prosecution tried hard to contain. ADA Reed successfully argued to keep the evidence of the mother's murder strictly controlled during the Tiffany Lawson trial, fearing it would distract the jury and strengthen the defense's argument of lifelong mental instability. The focus had to remain on Tiffany. As the trial date approached, the media descended on Flint, eager to capture the sensational contrast, the innocent victim of faith and future versus the wretched, tormented killer of desperation and decay. The tension was thick, not just between the legal teams, but within the community itself, which struggled to understand how such a monster had walked among them, invisible, for so long. Deborah Lawson maintained her quiet, spiritual strength, but she knew her role was crucial. She had been asked to prepare her victim impact statement, the singular moment where the family would finally be allowed to speak directly to the court and to the public about the life that was stolen. She spent weeks writing and rewriting, determined that her words would honor Tiffany, not dwell on the evil of Lori Vance. She wanted the jury to see Tiffany's light, not just the darkness of her end. The courtroom itself became a theater of profound collective grief. On the morning the jury selection began, Lori Vance was brought in, shackled, her face gaunt, her eyes distant. She barely acknowledged her defense team, seeming to float above the reality of the proceedings. Detective Sarah Chen, now the lead witness on the forensic breakthrough, sat at the prosecution table, her years of dedication converging on this room. She watched the Lawsons enter, their posture stoic, and knew that every piece of evidence she presented, every piece of testimony she offered, was a step toward giving them the justice they had waited 22 years for, a justice built molecule by molecule, tracing the ghost left by a traumatized killer. The trial was about to begin, and the ultimate agonizing truth of Tiffany Lawson's final moments would soon be laid bare for the world to witness. The trial for the murder of Tiffany Lawson began with a heavy, somber intensity that permeated the Genesee County courtroom. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was an inquest into the soul of a city and the limits of human depravity. Lori Vance, the defendant, sat motionless, a figure of profound desolation, often staring at the ceiling tiles, seemingly disconnected from the reality of the charges. Assistant District Attorney Monica Reed opened her case not with histrionics, but with cold, devastating facts. She began by holding up the blurry, smiling photograph of Tiffany Lawson, juxtaposing it instantly against the horrifying crime. "The evidence you will see is repulsive," Reed stated, her voice steady and clear, addressing the jury. "But it is necessary. It is the evidence of intent, not madness." The defendant, Lori Vance, was not a monster driven by rage, but a quiet predator driven by a grotesque form of greed. She killed Tiffany Lawson, not for passion, but for profit. She was calculating enough to lure her, strong enough to subdue her, and detached enough to prepare her remains for sale. We are here to prove that a broken mind can still form capital intent. The prosecution's case was a chronological march toward conviction, starting with the law enforcement testimonies. Detective Sarah Chen took the stand, guiding the jury through the 22 years of silence, the frustrating dead ends, and the ultimate, meticulous breakthrough of forensic genetic genealogy. She detailed the isolation of the epithelial DNA, the tracing of Lori Vance's family tree by Dr. Vivian Chu, and the final, irrefutable match from the discarded cigarette butt. Science, once the hope of the investigation, was now its absolute, unassailable witness. The most difficult moments came with the forensic presentation. The medical examiner, maintaining a strictly professional demeanor, testified to the exact method of death, the clean, fatal cuts to Tiffany's major veins, a surgical act designed for rapid blood loss, and the chilling condition of the remains. Photos of the abandoned house, the specific brand of cheap kitchen knife found beneath the floorboard, and the descriptions of the frozen internal organs were presented. The air in the courtroom became thick, punctuated by gasps and the rustle of tissues. Jurors, forced to confront the terrible banality of the killer's logistics, struggled to maintain composure. But the emotional centerpiece, the moment the courtroom held its collective breath, was the testimony of Deborah and David Lawson. David Lawson, a man weathered by faith and time, spoke first, detailing the agonizing void left by his daughter's disappearance. He described the endless hope, the constant prayer, and the final crushing certainty of the remains. Then came Deborah. She walked to the stand, a woman whose profound grief was transformed into stoic dignity. She spoke of Tiffany's kindness, her dreams, and the unshakable family bond. She looked directly at the jury, her eyes steady, never once glancing at Lori Vance. Her testimony culminated in the singular, devastating sentence she had prepared for this moment, a summation of their 22-year ordeal. "When Tiffany was taken from us, we didn't just lose a daughter. We lost the future our faith had promised us. And for 22 years, we had to love a memory that the law refused to honor." The Lawsons left the courthouse not in triumph, but in a profound exhaustion, the silence around them no longer the terrifying silence of the missing, but the deep, quiet reverence of justice finally served. The final reckoning had been delivered. The conviction of Lori Vance closed a chapter in the history of Flint that had been etched in fear and sorrow for 22 years. The Frozen Homicide, once an unsolved mystery that fed the dark fantasies of the city, became a definitive cautionary tale about the intersection of neglect, delusion, and scientific persistence. The legal victory was absolute, yet the emotional recovery would be ongoing. Lori Vance was transferred to a maximum security facility, her life shrinking to the confines of a concrete cell. Under continuous psychiatric observation, she began to stabilize slightly, though her internal delusions about financial worth persisted. The trauma she endured, the abuse, the murder of her mother, the years of addiction, did not vanish, but the system that had long ignored her now contained her. Her final fate was one of utter isolation, a lonely end that mirrored the deep psychological alienation that had driven her to prey on Tiffany's kindness. The truth of her mother's murder, though never prosecuted, remained a haunting shadow over the case. Detective Chen initiated a thorough review, but with decades past and the original crime scene compromised, the only witness was Lori's own unstable confession. Chen ultimately filed the old case as closed, confessed, not prosecuted, a silent nod to the terrifying cyclical nature of abuse and violence that defined Lori Vance's entire existence. Lori, the abused child who turned killer, was finally imprisoned not for running from her past, but for letting that past consume an innocent future. For Deborah and David Lawson, the verdict marked a profound turning point. They had battled not just a killer, but the crushing indifference of time itself. They held a final private memorial for Tiffany, acknowledging the parts of her that had been returned and committing her full memory to their hearts. David, finding a new avenue for his resolute discipline, channeled his energy into establishing the Tiffany Lawson Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing vocational and technical trades, ensuring Tiffany's humble, achievable dreams would continue to inspire others in Flint. Deborah, forever the spiritual anchor, maintained her vigil, but the white lilies on the kitchen table now represented redemption through truth. "We don't pray for the killer," Deborah told a local reporter, granting one of her few public reflections after the trial. "We pray for the children who are growing up today in the darkness Lori Vance knew." Tiffany was taken by the darkest consequences of neglect. Our justice is a moral one. It proves that even the smallest, most ignored person, the evidence on a piece of plastic, can speak the loudest truth. The case also enshrined Detective Sarah Chen and Dr. Vivian Hsu as pioneers. The use of forensic genetic genealogy in Flint was a resounding success, leading to the establishment of a dedicated FGG unit in the state. Chen used the Larson case to train a new generation of investigators, emphasizing the patience and scientific faith required to solve cold cases. "We proved that every crime scene has a ghost," Chen would later say in a retirement ceremony, reflecting on the 22 years. "And with technology, that ghost can always be given a voice." Lori Vance thought she was invisible. She thought she was worthless. But the tiny piece of herself she left behind was the most valuable, defining evidence of all. The legacy of Tiffany Lawson is the story of a moral victory snatched from the jaws of decades-long despair. It is a powerful reminder that justice is not always swift, but it can be relentless. It underscores that the deepest, most terrifying evils are often forged in the silence of human suffering, but that perseverance, in the quiet faith of family and the unyielding science of the law, can ultimately pierce the darkness. Tiffany's light, though extinguished in 1995, shines today as a beacon of hope in the ongoing pursuit of justice for every unsolved crime.